already. My name is Kirsten Nelms, and I'm here on behalf of Leaf Dealer. Some of you probably know Leaf Dealer has been partnering with CFC Canada and community foundations now for quite a few years. And to me personally, I feel like it's one of the most important things that we do. The work that the community foundations do is so impactful and important. And every time I get an opportunity to attend one of these vital sign events, I leave with a whole new perspective and an immense amount of gratitude for all of the work that you guys do. So really, you have a jam-packed agenda. I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manjeek, and thank you, Kirsten. I'm Betty Baxter. I'll be your moderator for today. And I just want to do a quick highlight. You all received the agenda. A couple of comments. As Manjeet said, we are recording the outcomes, and we'll be providing a report. If any of you are uncomfortable with the recording, please feel free to turn your video off or to take your name down so that you can participate and still respect whatever your privacy needs are. The other point I just wanted to make sure that we know before I introduce our first speaker, we'll be going through a number of speakers, and we wanted to make sure we have a chance for dialogue about the information that's presented, but we'd ask you to hold your questions. We've got speakers specific to the living wage information and experiences with living wage, but we will hold questions till after our first 4 speakers. Then we've got a block of time, hopefully for a nice plenary Q&A, but you're always welcome to put questions in the chat if we don't get to them or if I don't see you when you're asking for a question. And we will answer all the questions that are in the chat prior to the end of the, at the end of the session or in the report. The other thing then, we'll have a second Q&A after we have a speaker on the policy issues. So you've got your agenda in front of you, but I just wanted to highlight that sometimes speakers love to be interrupted because it lets them regroup their thoughts. But we'd like you to hold the questions so that we all get a chance to participate. I think that's it in terms of the specifics. We will have a chance at the end for any comments, and I'll do my best to kind of summarize our findings from today, and we'll talk a little bit about the report at that time. So with that, I will turn it over to Anastasia and ask Anastasia French from Living Wage for Families campaign to take us through our first presentation. Anastasia.
Hi, very nice to see you all. There should be a presentation that should be appearing, I'm hoping. If not, I can share my screen.
I'm going to be doing it. Just give me 1 sec here.
Perfect. So yeah, I'm Anastasia. I'm the lead organizer for Living Wage for Families. I'm based on the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm going to give a brief overview on what we do at Living Wage for Families BC. We've got some amazing, brilliant, exciting speakers who will go into a bit more detail about some of these topics. So I'm going to try and give a really headline one. So next slide. So first of all, what is the living wage? Well, the living wage is the hourly amount that a family needs to be able to afford basic essentials. I know that Maggie is going to go into a lot more detail about what kind of went into the living wage calculation within the Sunshine Coast, but I think it's important to kind of say that we in partnership with the CCPA help calculate what the kind of draft framework is, and we provide communities then with the tools to be able to calculate the living wage locally. And we try and make that balance so that the living wages are kind of consistent across the province, and when you're looking at figures, you know that they're taking their costs from the same kind of things. And it really is the basics that a family needs. So it's very much a living wage rather than necessarily a thriving wage. So it doesn't, for example, include savings for retirement. It doesn't include kind of holiday vacations or other kind of things. It's just really what a family of 4 with two working parents needs to be able to afford food, rent, and childcare for their families. Next. And here at Living Wage for Families BC, we kind of do 3 main things. So we, as I mentioned, calculate what the living wage is for communities across British Columbia. We certify those employers who commit to pay both their direct staff and their contracted workers a living wage. And we also advocate for government policies that help families make ends meet. So for example, last year, we tried to enable employers to help support the kind of campaign for paid sick leave. And in the past, we kind of supported the $10 a day campaign for childcare and looking at other initiatives to help kind of both lower the cost of living, but also raise wages in any kind of initiatives. Next. And here we are today. So this number actually, because as of yesterday, is slightly out of date. So there's now 345 living wage employees across the province. And as you can see from that graph, it's just shot up in the past couple of years. I think many employers, many organizations have realized the benefits of paying a living wage and the benefits that they found from doing so. There's over 30,000 people across the province who work for living wage organizations. 17 of those are public bodies. So that's municipalities, that's school boards, that's First Nation councils. The largest living wage employers tend to be municipalities at the moment. We've got a couple of businesses in there. So Van City Credit Union, SAP Vancouver, who are a tech firm, but it's a really interesting mix of different organizations, right down to small coffee shops where they hire three or four staff. So any kind of organization can get involved. And for me, the biggest sign of success for us as an organization is the fact that there are over 1,000 people in BC who have received a pay increase because their employer has committed to making sure that they earn a living wage. And that really is game changing for their lives, especially those who might have been on minimum wage before. That's an extra $8,000 in their pockets every year. And if you can think about what they're doing with that money, that's and how that can change their lives, it's really brilliant. Next. And this is one example of why it's great and the difference it can make. So this is Caroline. Caroline lives on Vancouver Island. She's worked for her living wage employer since June last year, as a support worker. And she loves working there. She really, the benefits they offer, the fact they offer time off for wellness, the morale. But actually for her, the biggest difference has been the living wage element, because in previous jobs where she's not earned a living wage, it was really different. She had to work every day. She worked multiple jobs. It was putting her health at risk. And she was 100% always worried and really stressed. And actually earning a living wage means that she can now afford really basics in life. So to go to the dentist, to buy a winter jacket, nicer, healthier groceries. But for her, the biggest difference has been on her independence. And this quote is genuinely true. She no longer, and I hear this from so many women who are low wage workers, and they're predominantly, you're more likely to be a low wage worker if you're female, is that she no longer has to cozy up in relationships that she doesn't want to be in, because she can now choose to be able to live on her own and make her own decisions because she earns a living wage. And so that's just one real difference in life that a living wage can make to someone's life. Next. And we've seen during the pandemic that low paid workers were the ones that were on the front line, keeping us fed, keeping us safe, keeping us cared for. Disproportionately, COVID-19 affected people in poverty. That's because they were having to work multiple jobs to make ends meet, living in overcrowded housing, multiple touch points to potentially contract and spread the virus. They're also unable, prior to last year, to be able to take time off because of the lack of sick pay. And I think as a result, there was a real growth of understanding and support of the vital work done by low wage workers that I think previously people hadn't appreciated. So the important work that cleaners were doing, grocery store workers were doing, or to keep us fed and safe and cared for. And actually then there has been an impact on employers who have realized that they need to be able to pay a living wage, both to make sure that their staff are safe and cared for, that their staff don't have to work in or live in overcrowded housing, which potentially they could bring COVID into their business and then spread it. But also because they know if they want to recruit and retain staff, they need to be paying a living wage. And I think that's part of the reason we've seen that growth that you saw in that graph before. Next. And for employers, they've seen a benefit of paying a living wage that goes above and beyond the kind of the moral reasons of paying a living wage. For them, it kind of makes good business sense as well. And I think that's really important to kind of stress this. So 97% of living wage employers in BC have found some kind of benefit for being part of the program. The main benefit has been good publicity for the organization, that they can say that they're a living wage employer, that they're proud of it. They can put our decals on their stuff. It's increased staff morale. It's helped them live their values. It's lowered staff turnover. It's increased productivity. Just the benefits just keep on going. And then there's a whole range of other benefits which is specific to those employers. But it's really great to see that it's employers telling us the benefit that they found. And the other reason for that growth is it's employers spreading the word about how proud they are to be a living wage employer, to take care of their staff. And that's encouraging other businesses within their sectors to get involved too. Next. And then there's a knock-on impact for the local community, because when living wage employers, they commit to pay both their direct staff and their contracted workers a living wage. So those organizations that are the contractors, they know that they've got to pay their staff a living wage while doing business with that living wage employer. And then that's a knock-on impact. When low wage workers get a pay increase, they're more likely to spend that money locally than when a high wage worker gets a pay increase, because often high wage workers, those pay increases are invested in savings or in vacations and in lots of other things. Whereas when low wage workers get, that's more money that they're just going to go and spend in small businesses, to buy food, to buy in cafes, in lots of things. And so that really helps continue that local supply chain. And then there's also the impact of working poverty has that we're all aware of for social programs, for healthcare, for education, for employment, things like that. Next. This is, and the kind of one of the ones we try and stress is the kind of the important role that government can play, both at a local level and a provincial level. As the largest employers in the community, they can be community champions and cause that ripple effect through local supply chains, through their procurement policies. And we've now seen 20% of living wage applications. The reason that those organizations are getting on board is because they want to do business with the living wage municipality, and they know that if they pay a living wage that they're more likely to win that bid, or they have to win. It might, if they're paying a living wage, they have to as part of that, but then if they're a living wage employer, they might get more points in their RFP, and that's a really nice impact that we've seen from local government getting involved. So there's a list of kind of all of the municipalities that are living wage employers, with some libraries and some First Nation councils as well. Next. I believe that's my last slide, but I'm not sure. Next.
Yeah, that was it.
Great. I knew I had a short time, so I know I whizzed through that.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to, you can either, please, I know we're not taking questions right now, but put them in the chat and we can come to it later. And also, if you want to get in touch with me separately to this, my email address I can put in the chat for everyone to see.
Wonderful, Anastasia. Thanks so much. And thank you for sticking to your time. Clearly a ton of information there. And I'm sure people will follow up with you. And we will come back in about 15, 20 minutes to see if there's questions you can answer today. Our next speaker is Maggie Quan, and she will be talking about the living wage for the Sunshine Coast and bring us to a local while you all get a breath a little bit from hearing Anastasia. Maggie, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready. I think Wendy's just pulling up the presentation.
There we go. We've got a slide on my screen.
Yeah, I just need to start the show. Give me one sec here.
No problem. Oh, wonderful.
How's that looking?
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you everyone who's spoken so far. As Betty said, my name is Maggie, and I am going to chat with you a little bit about the living wage specific to the Sunshine Coast. Anastasia just gave us a beautiful overview of the living wage as a program and how it impacts people who earn it and don't earn it. But I thought we'd go back a step and talk about how the living wage is calculated for the Sunshine Coast. So Wendy, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. All right. As Manjeet shared earlier, the living wage for the Sunshine Coast calculated in 2021 was $19.79 an hour. If we assume that both parents in the living wage family are making an equal wage, this would be about $36,000 per parent or $72,000 for the household. I was a little bit surprised to see that this is currently the third highest living wage in the province after Vancouver and Victoria. And over the last 10 years, the living wage has increased by 5% from $18.80 in 2021 to 2011 to $19.79 in 2021. And 5% is an interesting increase, but I think as we read the news of 1 year inflation of 4.8%, it's a little startling, and it is a gap that I think is interesting. One thing I really wanted to mention as we start is that this is a conservative estimate of living costs for families. And Anastasia mentioned that. I just wanted to say, when we see some of these costs, if they appear low to you, we can chat about that, and I'll offer some thoughts about why that may be as well. So Wendy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. All right. So we're basically going to walk through the different budget categories or inputs for the living wage calculation. The first of which is shelter and utilities. And in our Sunshine Coast calculation, that totaled just over $2,000 a month. That's rent for a 3-bedroom unit, utilities, tenant insurance for $30,000 worth of goods, and internet. And again, this is where I want to emphasize the conservative part. One of the strengths of the living wage is that it is uses a consistent methodology across the province so that these are comparable to each other. One of the issues, though, for a smaller area like the Sunshine Coast is that some of these data sources are hard to get at. So we've pulled shelter costs from the recent Sunshine Coast housing needs assessment, simply because there isn't regular collection of rental costs on the Sunshine Coast. So that was the most recent and relevant example of housing costs, but we did hear as we were putting the report together that number seemed low, particularly to those who work in housing or as housing advocates. So I think it's important to mention that rent is an average, and families who have been in a unit for, say, the last 5 years or longer are likely paying lower rent because there are limits on rent increases per year, where newer residents may be paying higher rent simply because when an old tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in, landlords have a lot more freedom in raising the rent. Next slide, please, Wendy. Thank you. Another big monthly cost is food, $972.15 a month to feed a family of 4. The children in the living wage family are 4 and 7 years old. So this covers off everyone. One thing to note here, just a methodology note, this cost uses regional food costing data that is primarily collected in the Lower Mainland. And Sunshine Coast food costs anecdotally are higher due to additional transportation costs. So varying things over. All right. Our next cost is childcare. So this is looking at the cost of full-time care for a 4-year-old and supplementary care for a 7-year-old. So for the 7-year-old, that would include before and after school care, the cost of care over school breaks when parents are working, and the cost of care over the summer. And I'm not sure if any of the folks from Sunshine Coast Childcare Resource and Referral are on the call, but just a thank you to them because they had recently collected this data and it made it really easy for us. All right, thank you, Wendy. On to transportation, $476.75 a month. This is the cost of owning and operating a used vehicle and the cost of a bus pass. As usual, I'll share some Sunshine Coast quirks. This does not include ferry cost. So the cost of traveling to Vancouver for things like specialized medical appointments, other appointments with professionals, etc. That is not included in here. And this looks at the cost of one used vehicle, and depending on which community you're in the Sunshine Coast, that might be sufficient. But just wanting to note, our steering committee flagged the fact that some communities have better public transport than others, and the communities that don't have very good public transport may need to have two vehicles for 2 working parents. Next one. Oh, thank you, Wendy. Healthcare, pretty standard input. This is the cost of non-MSP healthcare, so things like prescriptions and dental, and it's a flat rate of $188 a month. Prior to this, I think in 2019, the last time the living wage was calculated, MSP would have just been eliminated. And so there's a great example of how policy can support families. This calculation doesn't have MSP because families no longer have to pay for it. All right. Next category is telecommunications. We're looking at $114 a month, and that is the cost of 2 cell phones with Canada-wide talk and text and 4 gigs of data. It does not include the cost of the phones themselves, which are expensive and which families would have to come up with, probably using their contingency funds, which we'll talk about in a moment, or their other funds. All right. The next category is clothing and footwear. The family has just under $173 a month for this, which amounts to about $43 a person a month. And this comes from Statistics Canada's market basket measure. So nothing too fancy here, just sort of enough to cover the basics. Next slide, please. Thank you, Wendy. All right. Parents' education. This is a piece of the budget that's added in the hopes of advancing parents' education and supporting one of the parents or both to finding a higher paying job. This comes in at just under $100 a month, and it is the cost of 2 courses a year at Capilano University. So tuition, fees, and a textbook estimate. All right, just a couple categories left. This one is contingency, and the family puts $230.88 in there per month. It's short-term savings. So I think Anastasia mentioned that there is no long-term savings in the living wage. This is just meant to help families out in a jam. So they wouldn't necessarily be building this amount up year over year. But it would cover things like taking time off for being sick, or if a parent lost a job and they needed a little bit of a cushion before they started a new one. So just a small bit of security. And the other category, and so this one comes out at about $863 a month, and this is kind of the catch-all for things that aren't included elsewhere. So, personal care items, hygiene items, household supplies like toilet paper, furnishings, and any kind of entertainment or recreation that can be fit in after the more important things have been purchased. And I know I've mentioned this, but there are a number of things that aren't included in the living wage calculation. So the living wage calculation does not include any debt payments. If the parents in this family still had student loans, or if they had credit card debt, of course, they would need to earn more to pay for those things. It does not include savings for a down payment of a house. So it assumes they'll be renting indefinitely. It does not include savings for the children's education, so no RESP. Does not include savings for parents' retirement, and then a note that some people in this sort of living wage generation are also overlapping with the sandwich generation, and they may be caring for their children while also caring for aging parents, but that cost isn't included. And that's me, and I look forward to chatting with you more about it after the next couple of presentations.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Very useful information. And for those that haven't been popping into the chat, there has been a couple of questions in the chat and a couple of answers. And it's great in terms of helping our future presenters to know that they can tailor their comments a little bit, and also to help the presenters who have just spoken to prepare for any further questions. So with that, we're now going to shift gears a little bit and go to some reps from organizations that have some experience being living wage employers. And our first one is from First Credit Union in Pearl River, Caitlin Bryant. Caitlin, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go, yeah.
Okay.
I have some
Over to
slides.
you.
Thanks. I've got some slides as well, so I'll just hold on a second until I see those. But my name is Caitlin Bryant, and I'm the Social Impact Specialist at First Credit Union, coming to you today from Tla'amin Nation territory, a little further up the Sunshine Coast, and really excited to be here and be a part of this conversation and just hear all of the questions and all of the dialogue that comes up.
Sorry, Caitlin, I'm just having a little bit of a issue here. So
yeah, it's mostly okay. Perfect. That's great.
that okay?
Yeah, they're not critically important slides. It's really just something fun to look at. So
yeah, I think it's a big PowerPoint, and I think my computer's having trouble with it. So maybe we'll just go like that if you're ready.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. So just a note to say that as the social impact specialist, that is the lens that I'll be speaking with today. If there's questions that come up that are better suited for someone in our human resources department, I can definitely make their contact information available or make an introduction, and we're happy to have conversations with folks around this. So from our experience at First Credit Union was actually the first credit union, really creative name, incorporated back in BC. So the first ever credit union incorporated in BC back in 1939. And we operate 8 branches around the south coast of BC with approximately 100 employees. All of our branches are located in small cities or rural areas and areas that have historically been thought of as very affordable until more recent times, of course, when we've seen the major impacts of housing shortage and also skyrocketing real estate markets in the urban areas around us. Credit unions in general are cooperative institutions too. So they have been created and initiated by citizens seeking economic equity and access to financial products and services directly within their community. Credit unions are democratically controlled by their members, which means that a credit union's organizational health and wellness is intrinsically linked to the health and wellness of the membership. In other words, the individuals and small to medium-sized businesses, nonprofit organizations that really make up the foundation of the communities that we all live and work in. So First Credit Union became a living wage employer in 2019. And at that time, we didn't actually need to increase our wages to become certified. We were paying a living wage. However, there were 3 main reasons it was really important for us to become a certified living wage employer. Next slide, please. So living our values, first of all, being a certified living wage employer is an action that we can take to embody our vision of financially healthy communities. So just like we measure and report out on our GHG emissions so that we can reduce our environmental impact of operations, we also have a responsibility to our members, our employees who are also members in our case, and the communities that we served to offer meaningful work and sustainable wages. In 2019, we partnered with the City of Pell River and Lyft Community Services to engage the Kithet region in a poverty reduction strategy. And through extensive data gathering, research, and outreach, paying a living wage and encouraging others to become certified living wage employers was identified as a key action towards eliminating poverty in the region. So for us, the data is in, and we know that we're on the right track towards creating financially healthy communities by being a living wage employer and encouraging others to do so too. Next slide, please. Secondly, leading by example. This is a really important piece for us. Being a certified living wage employer demonstrates our commitment to economic equity, sustainable communities, and the broader living wage ethos, which we know is critical for moving forwards towards greater economic equity. Many of our members are small to medium-sized businesses, just like we are. And so if we're not prepared to pay a living wage, how could we possibly advocate for anyone else to do so? And according to Stats Canada in 2020, small businesses, defined here as 99 employees or less, employed 68.8% of the labor force. So that's a huge number. If every small business in our region or in BC or across Canada made paying a living wage a minimum cost of doing business, we could see some real impact. Next slide, please. So thirdly, taking responsibility. For us, we haven't ever based our business model on paying a minimum wage. So when we became a certified living wage employer, as I said, we didn't need to increase our pay, but we did get to label that value And we also was really important for us to be able to join forces with Living Wage Families BC to help foster a movement towards greater economic equity. That's sort of the business that we're in as a credit union. And in the current competitive employment landscape, paying our employees a living wage is not an end goal, it's a baseline. As we've heard in the description of how we come up with the basic living wage, it's a bare minimum cost of doing business. And so time is ticking, inflation marches on and wages are not. And thinking about the poverty reduction work that we have been a part of in the Kithet region, in a recent community wellness survey, 37.7% of all participants responded that they regularly face challenges meeting their family's financial needs. 54% of individuals living alone reported that they regularly face challenges meeting their financial needs, and 72% of lone parents said that they regularly face challenges meeting their family's financial needs. So those are huge numbers. Next slide, please. So I think just in closing, it's safe to say that everyone on this call here today cares a great deal about the people in their communities. We wouldn't be here discussing a living wage if we didn't. But I think it's also important to remember that systems in and of themselves aren't caring, right? Systems and institutions, just like credit unions, are really structures and tools created by us. And we, the humans designing these structures and tools, are not are not considering and taking the actions needed to inject that care and the humanity and the basic respect, the system or the institution will never be able to add that in for us. So it's really up to all of us as individuals to advocate for a living wage or other actions needed that builds in the equity within the systems that we all operate in. And I would just end with my favorite quote around this kind of community work. I'm sure you've heard it before. As Margaret Mead so eloquently said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was clearly, I think many people will resonate with your final words. We'll give Wendy a moment to pull up the next slideshow. I'm assuming there may be one. Our next speakers are from the City of Victoria, Jody Jensen and Marianne Alto. And then we will open up for some Q&A. So nobody needs to feel too rushed. We're about 5 minutes ahead of time, which is a place where we love to be at this point in the meeting. So thanks everyone for being on time. Marianne and Jody, are you ready to go?
Yep, we sure are.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks very much, Betty. And wow, never tell an elected person they have an extra 5 minutes. But I promise I won't use that up. We just have a very brief presentation, and because we're really kind of keen to be involved in the dialogue. But let me start by saying, yes, I'm Councillor Marianne Alto from the City of Victoria. I'm here with my colleague, Jody Jensen, who's the head of our Human Resources Department. And we'll both together speak just for about 7 minutes or so. I'm coming to you, as is Jody, from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, with whom we have a very, very rich relationship, which is extremely important to the city. It's one of our priorities, has been for this term, and I hope will continue to be in the future. It's a great treasure and an honor to be able to live and work together on these territories, and the work that we do with the nations closest to us, on whose lands the city has been built, is a great treasure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Victoria. Many of you know from the reputation what it is, but I just wanted to remind you of a few realities. Generally, Greater Victoria has a reputation for being fairly wealthy, well-to-do, and certainly parts of it are. But in the city itself, which is actually just the core of the region of the Capital Regional District, our median income is significantly lower than the regional median at only $52,000. And that is significant because we try to provide services for the residents, but also for all of the many people who work in the city who come from around the region. And that drives up a lot of the prices around transportation and food and retail and whatnot. And so it really is a challenge for us and for our residents of the city to be able to compete with all of the folks in the rest of the region. 40% of our households are lone parent families with kids, and that is a little bit higher than in the region. And so again, that's another pressure point for us in trying to look at the living wage. And the majority of our households are renters, which again is quite anomalous in the region. And so again, this is a position where the majority of our residents really do have that pressure of stretching their dollars a little bit further every single day. And a significant portion of our households are in subsidized housing, 13% right now, but that is increasing as the province is investing more and more money in the city, predominantly in the city, much more so than in the region broadly around supportive and subsidized housing. And that affordability crunch has really been a huge challenge for the city in the last few years in particular, but we anticipate will continue to be for the foreseeable future as we struggle to try and provide affordable housing for everyone who wants to live here. And one of the key pieces for that, and it is relevant to the living wage piece, is that without the living wage, we have an enormous number of people who speak to us during land use applications where they say, look, we would like to live in the city, we work in the city, we play in the city, our kids go to school in the city, we can't afford to live there because we just don't make enough money to deal with the cost of either rental or home ownership, which is of course becoming less and less likely for anyone who doesn't already live here. Next slide, please. So we started working on the living wage. Actually, it was one of the first things that I tried to initiate in the city way back when in 2014. And so we kind of had fits and starts. And at that time, it was a pretty loose organization. There weren't a lot of places in British Columbia that had living wage certification at that time. And the programs weren't quite as established. And I would say at that point, not as easy to become involved with and try and work together with colleagues across the province to try and figure out what this meant. But fast forwarding back into 2019, we finally got to a point where we really had everything together, all the pieces that were required to be certified. And after a year or so of very intense work by our staff, we finally were certified in January of 2020. And this photo that's on the slide here is when we were actually presented with our certificates. And as you can see, this was during our fabulous COVID time where we were all demonstrating our wonderful fashion statements of masks. But it really was a celebratory day for us because we had spent so long trying to make sure that we came up to the standards required to be certified as a living wage employer. And why did we do that? I mean, why did it take so long? We really thought that this was something that was absolutely essential in order to serve the residents with the ability of actually living in Victoria while they worked in Victoria. I mean, as I mentioned, so many of our own employees do live outside the city, and that's strictly because they can't afford to live inside the city. And so being in a position where we could say to all of our staff, yes, we're going to make sure that you have at least a living wage, really allowed the majority of our staff to at least consider moving back into the city if they didn't already. A part of that for us, of course, was trying to make sure that we found enough people to work for us, because obviously the whole relationship between income and expenses has been explained from previous speakers is absolutely key. And we wanted to make sure that the workers that we had not only were qualified and able to work with us, but could actually live in the city that they were serving. And of course, for us, we just wanted to make sure that all of the people who worked for the city weren't struggling as much. I mean, they still do struggle, but they weren't struggling as much with the cost of living that is just skyrocketing in a really dramatic way in the city of Victoria, as it is in so many other people, so many other communities. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jody in a sec, but I just wanted to really emphasize the fact that the city of Victoria is in a very fortunate perspective, and I think as is true for a few other communities, and that even before certification, the vast majority of our employees, because they're unionized primarily, did have wages that certainly were beyond the basic living wage. But even having said that, we really wanted to make sure that the few folks whose wages would be elevated by this commitment and this certification were able to join the workforce that was in that quite privileged position. And perhaps, as others have said, really significantly, we wanted the city to be a bit of an example for our colleagues in other municipalities around the province, and particularly on the island, to show that there is so many different benefits to this. It isn't going to be a particularly difficult thing to achieve, and the benefits far outweigh what cost might be accrued in that. And I'm going to turn it over to Jody now, who's going to speak a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of it and how it actually works. So over to you, Jody.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and pleasure to be with everyone this morning to talk about our experience. So I led the implementation of the living wage policy at the city, and as Marianne noted, the vast majority of our 1,100 employees were already earning a living wage because of, by virtue of the fact that they've been long since unionized. But there were a number of positions in our recreation division that were impacted by us becoming certified and saw an increase in their wages as a result. And these are positions which are typically really filled by young workers and by women workers. And so, I think this illustrates, that intersectional kind of understanding of equity and equitable outcomes when it comes to, economic opportunity and really ensuring that we were addressing what had been an historic, really kind of inequity in the wage schedules within the collective agreement. So we did work with our union to negotiate a wage adjustment for those 45 employees who were impacted. The annual cost of the city in our budget was about $10,000. So, within the scope of the city's budget, it was really quite insignificant. But for those individual employees, of course, that it comes with a significant impact in terms of their ability to be healthy, to have healthy families, and to be able to participate within the community and live in the community. As has been mentioned by others, the real impact when it comes to municipal employers is that sort of supply chain impact. Municipalities are huge purchasers of service within our region, which is Southern Vancouver Island. And so we're using our purchasing dollars in a way which benefits community and which is aligned with the values of the organization, right? So the City of Victoria already participated in social procurement initiatives to support social enterprise and local economic development. And so the living wage policy and requirements were simply incorporated into our existing social procurement initiative within our procurement policy. And that now becomes a part of and has become a part of all our RFP and RFO processes. Whereby, as has been mentioned, vendors can get additional credit or points through that process by being a living wage employer or by otherwise, supporting, local economic development or for folks who have been traditionally underrepresented within the workforce. So the next slide, please. So again, just very quickly, I will say that our biggest impact, for the city has been to purchasing, and for us that was in security services, right? So that was our largest contract, which was impacted, and that did have an impact in terms of cost, right, for us as a city. And we were very pleased when we went back out to market recently to be able to award that contract to a firm that had become a living wage employer itself, so that they, again, has been mentioned, could be more competitive in terms of securing the business of local employers like us who are living wage employers. And that has been noted that, these benefits from an employee engagement and recruitment and retention perspective, that's a benefit to the city, because people want to come and work for us if they see that we are an employer with values that align with their own. And so it's really had an impact for us to be able to say this is something that, we believe in, is important to us from our recruitment perspective, but also from the perspective of those contracted service providers. It has had an increase in their ability to recruit and retain staff. And that in turn has led to increased quality of services and increased value for the contracts that are in place for our community. And really that translates into improved value for taxpayer dollars. So even though it may cost a little more, the value and the quality of the service that's being received has increased as well. So with that, thank you very much. That concludes our presentation.
Thanks, Jody. And just to sign off to say, I think it's really clear from the city's perspective that our experience with this over the last couple of years has really shown that the small output in cost has well worth the rewards, both for the city, for our employees, and for all of the services and contractors that work with us. So we're big supporters and happy to speak with anyone about how to make it work and why it works well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Jody. You did it, Marianne. We're exactly on time.
Great.
We're back to our schedule, and now we're entering into a little bit of the unpredictable time. We have about 10 minutes for a round of questions, and if you can help us keep this orderly, if your question is to a specific speaker, if you can basically indicate that. If your question is a general one, I'm going to give our speakers sort of a free-for-all opportunity to share any information they may have. And I will limit it to 10 minutes, and then we'll move from this factual and experience-based discussion to a little bit more of policy and background info with our next speaker. So I'm just going to open it up. If you could use the hand raise function, I can see most of you at one time, but I will have to scroll through to make sure I don't miss you. If I do, please pop your question into the chat, and Naomi will help me order those, and if we can get them answered, that's great. So I'll just open the mic to 37 people here. Who wants to go first?
Betty?
I think there's a hand up, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Betty, good
I
morning.
think that was Bill Marabima. Go ahead.
It is. Thank you. Good morning. And thank you, everybody, for this. Very interesting. Actually, I've kind of lost track of this over the last couple of years. I've been keen on this a couple of years ago, and I guess we got busy on other things. It's nice to see it back on the table. I will be asking our council for resolution to move forward to investigate this, but I'm interested to know why it took the city of Victoria 1 year to get that certification. What were the major roadblocks to that? Was it rewriting policy, studying it, or what did it take to do it?
Thanks, Bill. I'll ask Jody to do that because she was actually instrumental in all of the different undertakings that were required. So over to you, Jody.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Thanks for the question. And Anastasia may have more to add on this as well, but the Living Wage Campaign establishes a certain list of criteria that employers or steps that employers have to take in order to be certified, and then make an application for certification. And so that included for us, a report to council, endorsement of council of proceeding to become certified. We brought a living wage policy to council for council approval. And then we worked with our purchasing staff to identify what the potential budget implications would be, particularly from a contracted services perspective, and did the costing as well in terms of impact on payroll, so that council was fully informed in terms of what the financial implications would be. And then we were able to proceed to, again, update our procurement policies, have those implemented, and then notify all of our existing contract service providers, and then ensure that all future bids included that information and requirements as well. And then we also had to take that step of sitting down with, in this case, QP Local 50, and negotiating an amendment to the collective agreement wage rates. So that's a bit of a summary.
So Bill, just to add on to that from your perspective, really appreciate that you're going to go to your council with a motion. So there's sort of three parts to this from my perspective. There's the political direction and the political will, which is what you're starting with your motion, which comes in and out of the process as staff do the various pieces of work that Jody identified. There's the enormous piece of work that staff do in order to ensure that all the pieces are in place and that all the thresholds are met. And then there is also the very important conversation with unionized staff about how this is going to affect them in a collective agreement, if at all. And so those three sort of envelopes of work all have to be in place simultaneously and in sequence as the process unfolds. And so you, in my view, of course, from my perspective, first you have to decide to do it, and that requires your council to make that commitment. And then it's really over to your staff to steer the process as it unfolds, coming back to council when required for further direction. And then very importantly, including the conversations with the unions.
Thank you for that. And I think what we'll do is what you'll see shortly with Gibson, so we'll probably move forward with that initial resolution, anticipating that we are probably looking at a 2023 budget type adjustment to everything, but we have to start soon. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'd add, first of all, thank you. That's great. If you need me to come and present, or I imagine people from the Sunshine Coast Foundation would be happy to do that. We're happy to come and help kind of make the case and explain to others the kind of the benefits of paying a living wage. From my kind of work that I've done with municipalities, the kind of something that takes like the hardest bit is the bit at the beginning to kind of, after you've got the political will, is the examining what's the impact going to be. And if I'm honest, most of the conversations I've had, they found that most of the direct staff are earning above a living wage. So actually there's not that huge financial cost there at the beginning. And then it's that piece for that contractor piece and understanding which contractors need to be done or need to be changed. And it's changing that policy going forward. Often it's the understanding that any new contracts need to include living wage clauses. And many employers go above and beyond to look at those contracts that are actually existing to see if they can be amended, but that's not a requirement from our perspective, because we know sometimes it's not possible to change contracts halfway through.
Thank you very much. We will follow up.
Okay, good stuff and great resources. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Given that one took about 5 minutes, we'll have probably time for one or two more. Is somebody else have a question?
Betty, we have Shannon and Chris with their hands up.
Okay. Shannon, you're going to have a bit of time in a minute, but do you want to run with this right now?
Well, I wanted to just note that there was a question in the chat that I think is a really important one around lone parents. So we could save that for later, or Anastasia or I could speak to that now, whatever would be preferable.
Now, and then we'll get more from you in a minute.
Sure. Well, so it is a really important question around whether the living wage is sufficient for lone parent families. And the short answer is no. When we were initially calculating the living wage, starting in 2008, we did the calculation to look at whether for a lone parent with one child, it would be sufficient. And it did used to be the case that it was for that family group, but that stopped being true in 2012, just due to the rising costs. So that is something that we're looking at as part of a larger review of the living wage calculation methodology that we're just starting to undertake, and we'll be connecting with all the various living wage communities about. But it really is an important issue, and it reinforces that the living wage is very much, it's a living wage, but it's also still a pretty basic income.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Chris, what was your question?
Yes, hi there. I just wanted to make a comment about the affordability of the housing piece. We have the challenge of access as well as affordability. So, if you can find a place, and affordability is not the only factor there, and I'm sure that'll come up later. But I also just wanted to talk about whether or not there were some examples of traditionally lower wage paying businesses, because a lot of the examples are from municipalities and other places that are typically paying $23, $27, $35 an hour. Like, are there examples from around the province, from communities where grocery stores or coffee shops, or those that are caught in that $16, $17 an hour, have signed on to this? Because a lot of the examples really seem to be industries that are typically known for paying higher than industry standard wages, or that anyways. Like, any construction site on the Sunshine Coast right now is paying a living wage guaranteed, walking on there with no experience. But there may be coffee shops or grocery stores that are not meeting that living wage. And so I just want to know if there were examples of non-municipalities and sort of larger organizations that had stepped up to the plate there.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to, first of all, just your first point about housing availability. I think you're really right. It's also an issue with childcare, right? And it's an interesting balance we have to do with the living wage. We can be like, this is the cost of something. This is the average cost that families are facing. But we're currently aware that there is a bit of a weakness there with it. Yeah, that can be the cost, but actually, can you find it? And that's something it's a kind of issue we're grappling with as part of the methodology review. I don't quite know we're going to necessarily find a solution, but that's something we are aware of and we're looking at. And I think Shannon might touch on it when she talks about policies in the future. And then your other point about pay increases, and you're completely correct. And I think with living wage, I think in the early days, it was, well, let's get it's easier for those organizations that already pay a living wage to get on board. And we very much want to encourage them to do that, because A, that's better. It gets the word out there about living wage, and B, that contractor piece that Jodie and Marianne talked about, that's another impact. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When we look at the impact and the success we're having as an organization and as a program, it's about lifting the wages of the lowest paid workers. We've seen a really interesting thing happen in Victoria, actually, with restaurants and cafes that are traditionally very low wage, or it's dependent on tips to top up, and tips can be very uncertain and those kind of things. And we've had a few restaurants and cafes in Victoria come on board first, and as soon as they got on board, they then encouraged their other cafes and restaurants within the area to get on board, and it was a really nice kind of positive thing where the businesses were encouraging it. So those who know Victoria, Spinnaker's, the brew pub, they've got breweries, they've got liquor stores, they've got loads of things. 60 to 70% of their staff got a pay increase to be brought up to the living wage when their owner decided it was actually during the pandemic, and he had to shut the restaurant, and he went away, and he was kind of reflecting during lockdown and kind of what was important to his reopening, and he realized that his staff were the most important thing, and he needed to bring them up to a living wage. So we've seen that piece of kind of encouraging it through that angle of businesses encouraging each other, and that's kind of helped lift the wages up in Victoria. The other thing that has the impact is the piece where municipalities or other living wage employers come on board, and they know that the security guards, for example, in Victoria, we've now had 3 or 4 security guards certify as a living wage employer, giving pay rises and pay increases to 90% of their workforce. And the reason that they're doing that is because they want to win that bid with the City of Victoria, and they want to do that. So that's where we're seeing that knock-on impact. But we're also looking as a program about how can we, where do we want to be, and where do we want to be focusing on? Do we want to be doing, traditionally we haven't been doing kind of aggressive campaigning at organizations to sort of say you need to be paying a living wage. Instead, we've been trying to make the kind of positive impact and kind of doing the knock-on impact in a more softly kind of way. But we definitely want to be looking at how do we target those industries that are traditionally low paid, and make sure that those pay increases are following suit. So great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have got some great discussion happening in the chat. Ted, thanks for your comments. I encourage people, if you had a question, don't forget it, pop it in the chat. But I'm going to move to Shannon's presentation, because many of our questions have a policy frame to them as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Shannon Dobb from the Center for Policy Alternatives. And hopefully we can all get a little bit smarter as we move through this. So Shannon, please tell us about your work.
Hi. Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for putting up the slides there. It should work as, it's a PDF, but it should work okay as slides in full screen mode. If that works. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this event and this conversation. I'm joining today from the unceded stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I want to just start, first of all, by congratulating you on this event today and on the Sunshine Coast's important work on the Sunshine Coast Foundation's, important work on the living wage and related initiatives over many years. As Betty said, I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives here in BC. And for those who may not be familiar with us, we're a research institute focused on issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. And a major long-standing focus for us at CCPA has been around poverty and low-wage work. So we partnered with the First Call Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition, the Victoria Social Planning Council, and the Hospital Employees Union back in 2006 and 2007 to work on the initial living wage calculation and campaign that was then launched in 2008. And every year we update the calculation methodology to reflect changes in various costs of living and the impacts of government policies over the previous year. So next slide. So why does public policy matter in this context? Oh, is the slide? Oh, there we go. Great. Thanks. So yes, why does public policy matter? This slide shows you another way of looking at the living wage calculation. It's essentially the underlying formula that constructs it. So the living wage as a concept and a campaign has two fundamental aims. first, to raise the incomes of low-wage workers, too many of whom, as we've talked about, are stuck below or near the poverty line, even if they work full-time and more. But second, it's to bring employers and workers together in seeking public policy changes that will materially improve our collective standard of living, but particularly for those in low-wage sectors and low-wage jobs. And public policy, I mean, you can see just from looking at this, obviously, and the various things we've already been talking about around housing and childcare, that public policy shapes the living wage in a number of ways. So we start by looking, as Anastasia oh, pardon me, I'm blanking on name. I think it was Maggie talked about looking at the basket of goods that make up a family's minimum expenses to meet their basic needs. And so it's a decent wage, but still very modest in terms of standard of living. And then we look at the income components needed to meet those expenses. So governments can shape a variety of parts of this equation. They can reduce living expenses by investing in areas like affordable housing and childcare, but they also contribute directly to family income. You know, employment earnings are the largest component of household income, but non-wage income in the form of government transfers also plays a big role. And of course, there's also tax policy that governments control as well. Next slide. So here we have the expense breakdown for the living wage family. I'm showing Metro Vancouver here, but the overall pattern is very similar for Sunshine Coast and elsewhere in BC. And you can, you know, see right away that housing and childcare alone represent more than half the family's expenses, with food and transportation being the next largest. And these are all things governments can influence. On the housing front, you know, of course, we know housing costs have skyrocketed since we first began calculating the living wage. In Metro Vancouver, the shelter amount for the living wage family went from just over $1,200 a month in 2008 to over $2,300 a month in 2021. So that's an 80% increase. And just for the record, the impact of official inflation over that period, the CPI, was actually only about 27%. So housing costs, rent specifically, far outstripping overall inflation rates. And we know the housing situation is having all kinds of impacts on households who deal with the stress of unaffordable rents and the constant threat of losing existing housing and then having to compete for scarce supply in the more expensive new listings rental market. And that impacts employers who struggle to attract and retain workers in high cost jurisdictions, which in turn puts upward pressure on wages, as we see directly through the living wage calculation exercise. And, you know, childcare is another area where we've seen huge increases in costs that far outstrip the consumer price index. Childcare fees for the Metro Vancouver living wage family jumped by almost half since 2008, from just under $1,000 a month to almost $1,500 a month in 2021. But the key thing here is that changes to provincial childcare policy starting in 2018 both reduced the fees charged by providers and reduced costs for families through the BC Affordable Childcare Benefit. And that benefit alone now offsets the living wage family's expenses by almost $600 a month. So that's huge. And that has a direct and sizable impact on the living wage rate itself. So when we calculated the living wage for 2019, just after those changes were introduced, the impact of those new childcare measures reduced the hourly wage by $3 compared to what it would have been otherwise. So that's a pretty huge benefit directly to employers who have committed to paying a living wage. Now, there's that big caveat here that we've been talking about, which is the lack of, you can calculate the cost, but if you can't get it, it's neither here nor there. And the lack of licensed childcare spaces means that many families can't get access, and so they get a lower subsidy amount as a result if they're in unlicensed or informal childcare situations. And I'll come back to that in another moment. Next slide, please. So here we can have a look at the role of those government transfers in directly supporting the living wage family income. The BC Affordable Child Care Benefit is one example that I already mentioned. There's also the federal child tax benefit, or Canada Child Benefit, The BC Opportunity Benefit also provide significant income to the living wage family, both of those. Notably, though, the GST credit, the BC Rental Assistance Program, and BC's Low Income Climate Action Credit, they all phase out at income levels that mean the living wage family isn't able to benefit at all, or just barely in the case of the Climate Action Credit. So any of these could be modified to have a longer tail, a phase out that has higher income thresholds, and that would provide additional income to the living wage family that then employers would reduce the pressure on living wage increases for employers. And then there's the tax side, which I won't get into in detail given the time we have, but the notable recent change that's already been mentioned was the elimination of MSP premiums, which made a big difference. If you're a lower income family, that was something that cost you a lot more as a share of your income compared to those with higher incomes. So next slide, please. Back to the expense side of the calculation. There are all kinds of things governments can do to reduce those costs for workers through the policy levers that they control. And these are just a few, certainly not a comprehensive list, but really the two that we need to zero in on if we're going to move the dial on these costs further is housing and childcare. On housing, we really badly need to see a large scale build out of affordable housing led by the province in partnership with local governments and supported by a beefed up and accelerated national housing strategy, which the current national housing strategy was brought in 2018, but it's been really slow to get money out the door and really chip away at the housing situation in a meaningful way. And the province also needs to use regulatory measures like vacancy control in addition to rent control if we're going to curb inflation in the rental market for folks who are having to move. And of course, there's a role that local governments can play, a whole variety of things they can do, among them addressing problems created by the Airbnb-ification of the housing stock. And I know that's particularly an issue on the coast and many areas of the province increasingly. On childcare, as we know, there's been some really positive moves recently. The provincial changes I already mentioned, and then there's this major federal commitment that's been made to a national $10 a day childcare program last fall, and that has since led to the signing of bilateral agreements, first with BC and now with all provinces and territories other than Ontario. So in BC, that agreement will see $3.2 billion invested in childcare over 5 years. And that, that's huge. That's really a substantial commitment that has the potential to be a game changer in childcare. So the key milestones are a reduction in average childcare fees by 50% by the end of this year. So it's ambitious, and a $10 and getting to average $10 a day fees by 2026 for children under age 6. So that will transform the financial reality for a lot of families. They'll go from paying upwards of $1,000 a month in net costs once you account for the current benefit to just paying $200 to $300 a month, which would be really quite incredible, and would significantly reduce the living wage hourly rate. So there's lots more we could say on the solutions here, but really the key takeaway is that the living wage invites employers into the conversation about public policy, and it invites them to become advocates for change by demonstrating the very real ways that action at all levels of government can impact their bottom line and also help tackle poverty and inequality. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Shannon. We will jump back into our conversation to see if there's more questions that Shannon's points have brought up or more comments. And then I'll get some information out to you about our breakout groups. We do want to have chance for you to talk among yourselves in a smaller group for 15 or 20 minutes to process some of this. But let's just open it up for about 6 or 8 minutes to see any more thoughts based on Shannon's information and what you've heard previously. Once again, Naomi, if you can help me see the hands up that I don't necessarily see. Any comments?
So far, no hands up, but there are some pieces in the chat that might be followed up on.
Yeah, I see Darnelda's piece and Ted's piece. I'm hoping maybe our speakers have had a chance to see some of this.
Well, maybe I can just quickly comment on Darnelda's point around around childcare and one of the biggest issues about being the lack of trained staff. And you know, the issue of wages for early childhood educators is a huge part of the challenge in childcare for exactly that reason. There's a lack of trained workers. There's a recruitment and retention problem across the province. And so for the $10 a day childcare campaign that the Coalition of Childcare Advocates has been advancing, and who deserve a huge amount of credit for the progress that we have seen recently federally and provincially, the issue of training and of a proper wage grid that actually pays. I mean, it's remarkable, really. You think about it, we pay people often around minimum wage to look after kids up to the age of 5, and then all of a sudden put them in the K-12 system, and it just changes overnight the way that we think about the role of those services. So paying childcare providers, as recognizing them as early childhood educators, paying them well, and making sure that they have living wages and beyond, so that they can be available to provide those services in their own communities is a huge part of that policy piece.
Other thoughts or comments? I mean, we don't have to stay on childcare. We can go any place. But go ahead, Darnella.
Yeah, I'll just bring up a few things. I mean, we've been working on this since September of last year, I think. The real focus, right? Following up on the childcare plan that was done in the Sunshine Coast. And I mean, some of the things we're looking at, yes, the living wage is an issue. Some of the employers here, though, are starting people at $20 an hour. So that would be considered a living wage here on the Sunshine Coast. But what we're looking at is we're actually going to reach out, CAPU is actually going to reach out to those people who maybe taken one course, not necessarily followed up, to find out what are some of the barriers so that we can look at getting people into the seats from the Sunshine Coast. One of them is that they typically have to pay for the course up front and then get reimbursed once they're complete. So we're looking at, can we as a municipality work with that somehow? Potentially have them, yes, front some of the money, so there's a stake in it, but maybe we as municipalities front the money and then we get reimbursed. So they're looking at how would that process work in the background. So we're looking at all of the various barriers, because they did, the last time they offered a course, they had 26 people on the list to read, who said they were interested. When they actually ran the course, they had one person. So what's stopping them from actually coming forward? So, we're working on all of those kinds of things behind the scenes. It's nice to be able to let the community know that, yes, it is a focus. We recognize the impact on, our community, particularly on those who are lower income. So how do we make that happen? So thanks for letting me get on my soapbox bit.
Thanks, Darnell. Shannon, I'm curious, if there's no other questions, what are some of the policy implications of, the Ministry of Education getting more involved in the pre-K area? And I'm also looking at the private versus public, which for sure probably has some policy implications and may actually ask or answer some of Darnelda's questions about barriers. Do you have any further thoughts on that? I don't want to hijack it with childcare, but it seems to me that childcare has got some opportunities, but there are some really interesting policy questions.
Yes, absolutely. And I was just typing away a bit of a response to Janice also. So, I mean, one of the really positive features of the new federal program commitment is that they are using the federal spending power effectively to require certain conditions in attached to the funds. And one of those is an emphasis on nonprofit development, which is positive for a number of reasons. And one of the challenges in BC has been that a lot of positive things have happened over the last few years on childcare, but there's been too much in practice, emphasis on private childcare development, and there's a whole discussion to be had there. But that's one of the really positive features about where we'll see things go over the next period of time. And sorry, I may have missed a piece that was bundled in there because I was typing while listening. But just to Janice's question about why $10 and not 20 or not 5. I mean, good question. Why not no fees? I mean, you could structure it any of those ways. But it's partly just a history piece. In Quebec, they brought in a $5 a day childcare program in 1997. It was hugely successful overall, broadly. And there's very extensive research that showed that program actually more than paid for itself quite quickly, as a result of so many more women being able to return to the labor market, primarily women, when they wanted to, and all of those women working pay tax as a result. And so the economic benefits of that investment were substantial. And we've done research at a provincial level, modeling a $10 a day plan that shows similar impacts. So the partly based as a result of that experience in Quebec, there was a lot of interest in structuring campaigns around a policy proposal in a similar kind of way. And just given time that had passed, and Quebec had increased its fees a bit, $10 a day is where the coalition of childcare advocates and various groups landed here in terms of pushing forward. And I certainly, I don't want to speak for them, but that has been looked at as a reasonably affordable benchmark, but with the important addition that the recommendation is also that fees be, that families under, I believe it's $40,000 a year, not pay any fees.
Okay, thank you. I've got Judy with a question, and then David, and then we'll go into some small group discussion. Go ahead, Judy.
Yes, thank you. I guess my issue, what I want to bring to this is looking at including immigrant population, and just making a comment. I've done a lot of work with immigrants on the Sunshine Coast, and the barriers to getting education and all of the issues, as well as their own issues of being new to the country. I guess I just want that to be included as a factor, because I don't think there's any necessarily representation directly from that group of people, or that it's been talked about. And I think there's quite a bit of additional factors involving individuals who are new immigrants, low income individuals. So I guess just a comment, Betty, not a question.
Okay. We'll maybe see if more of that may come out in the small group discussion.
Can I touch on that very quickly? So interestingly, when we were first, my understanding, when living wage and CCPA first back in the day, 15 years ago, we're looking at what should go into a living wage. We held focus groups with certain groups of populations that we knew were low wage workers. And one of those groups was definitely immigrant groups. They helped factor into that. And actually Mosaic, who do a lot to support immigrant populations, immigrant communities, they're one of our leading members of our advisory committee. So we definitely are aware of that, and as a result, certain things are in our calculation. So the cost of education and course, that came partly from those groups. But yeah, great point. And that's all I want.
Yeah, just to add to that, sorry, in terms of education, we had a number of our Tibetan women go through the healthcare assistant program at CapU. This is probably 5 years ago. At that time, it was $4,000 for the program. That's, it's a huge amount of money, just to bring it into perspective.
Thanks, Judy. David, you had a question.
Thank you. It's more of a comment on something that we've been sort of working with along with the Affordable Housing Society here in Gibsons. With one of the projects that they're working on is proposing that incorporated into what they're providing in affordable housing is the infrastructure that would support daycare. Quite often there's transportation issues. People might be able to have affordable housing, but they don't have a car. So suddenly, if they are worked or are working, there's issues with them getting children to daycare.
Yes.
So what we're looking at, we've mentioned it with a couple of the affordable housing projects, that in their infrastructure, they actually provide an area that would lend itself to daycare. And I think it's something that municipalities, through zoning and one thing and another, and things that are done with developers and building property, that it could help, just provide spaces that would work for daycare.
Thanks, David. That's a great point. And we're going to now try and change the format a little bit for those of you that have been quiet, to get you a little more involved. We've got 6 small groups, about 6 people per group. We also have some facilitators from the foundation board, and we'd like you to address the 4 questions on your agenda. What are some of the benefits and challenges of the living wage? What would a living wage mean for your business or organization? What policies could be implemented to reduce costs of living here? And what do you think should happen next? This will help shape the report from the session today, and each of you will have access to that. So again, to the questions, if we didn't get a question answered, keep it in the chat. Your groups will show up in the chat very shortly, and it will take us about a minute. Please select your group, go to the group, and then we've given you about 5 minutes per question. So you've got about 20 minutes in the group, so you can dig into this a little bit more. And we would like you to have a reporter that will come back, and we've left about 20 minutes at the end for you to share cross-group discussions a little bit. I know this isn't perfect. It would be so wonderful if we could be in the same room together, but we really hope that you can get a little richer conversation in these small groups, and having a foundation board member there will help move you through, but also have the foundation get a comprehensive report. I think everyone's back. We've lost a few. We were in the high 30s on our screen before, and now we're in the low 20s, but that's okay. We got a lot of good information out there. What I'd like to do is quickly go through your groups. We've allowed enough time for us to have 2 or 3 minutes from each group, and then have a little bit of time for crosstalk, which I will then try to collate into a bit of a reflection back for you. But because I have no other order, I will just start numerically. Group 1, I think that was Kim Turnat's group. Who was the reporter there, Kim?
That was me.
Perfect. Can
All
you
right,
give
hi, Nicholas. We talked about what a complex issue this was, becoming part of with all the moving pieces that go with this part of the negotiation. Sorry, I'm losing my notes are so messy here. And we also talked about how part-time work can be lost in this kind of a calculation. So that's a real issue with the living wage for communities, part-time work. And also there was also mention of a reverse pushback. So like, for example, living in Vancouver, $21 an hour is really difficult to live on, but that's the living wage there. So that was the first question. The second question was, what would a living wage mean for our organization? And so certification became part of the discussion that we talked about. And how every year how it would need to be recalculated. So we talked about how there's a template that can be used every year for adjusting the numbers at the end of every year to recalculate. Then we made it to 3 of the questions.
Okay.
So yeah, and so the policy issue, rentals were a big part of the discussion. Living in a vacation community, short-term rentals, also a retirement community. We talked about poverty reduction strategies, the SVD tax, and federal policy that's opening up foreign ownership for speculation. And also we talked about other educational, daycare, and healthcare policies that could assist in a living wage.
Okay. Thank you, Kim. Clearly, the complexity and the interplay of policy, certainly the groups that I popped into, that's complex. And we may see if some of our presenters have some thoughts on that. Group 2, I think that's David Kroll. Where are you, David?
That is me, Betty. Thank you. And we sort of started off, we sort of wandered into the weeds a little bit at the beginning. And then Betty joined us and got us back on track. But, some of the issues that Kim mentioned, we discussed, we're dealing with a rat race. So, you increase wages, but you're not being able to keep up with the increase in other costs like accommodation, fuel costs, travel. We talked about the problems people have of commuting great distances to get to work because they can't afford to live in the community that they're actually working in or providing a service in.
We've got somebody who needs to mute. If you're having another conversation, please hit your mute button. Go ahead, David, and we'll do what we can with that.
You talked about, small businesses, how it impacts on them if the wages increased. The other thing we got into was connecting the dots. Solving one problem doesn't solve all problems. And in some cases, it can potentially increase problems. For example, BC Housing provides funding for housing, but they not necessarily provide the funding to support the people in the housing, which creates other problems in a community, and it puts sort of stress on other departments like first responders who are now dealing with things out of their wheelhouse. So, if you get the funding to solve one problem, ensure you have the funding to support the problem you've just solved. Increase in wages, are you suddenly putting the people into a position where they got a raise, but now they're paying higher taxes and they've in fact just lost the raise they got? So ensuring that, as I said, solving one problem helps solve all the problems, not just one. The impacts we have of dealing with an environment which, as Kim mentioned, it's a tourist destination area. So, people can make much more income running their house as an STR as opposed to having a long-term tenant. And the town of Gibsons have been advocating both federally and provincially with our MLA and MP. Is there a way that government can incentivize landlords to rent by perhaps offering tax credits to landlords who provide long-term rental for people in dependent industries like first responders and caregivers. Just looking at my messy notes here, I think I covered most of it, unless someone else from our group wants to chime in.
Perfect. Thank you. Again, the complexity and the need for some incentives on more than one area. Thanks, David. I had another Dave. Dave, where are you for, I don't know what your group number was. There you go.
Group 3.
Dave, perfect. Group 3, you're up next.
Thanks, Betty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Doig. I'm one of the directors on the board of Sunshine Coast Foundation that's participating today. And I just wanted to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules this morning to participate in these important discussions. I had the pleasure of taking notes. And when I looked through my messy notes, it struck me that we tended to focus on benefits, challenges, and opportunities. And it seems that the benefits and challenges are circular. And so whereas there's a lot of evidence of the benefits of implementing living wage policies and practices, those benefits seem to be downstream, and there's a perception, potentially, especially in business communities, that there are upstream costs to implementing those policies, and they're not incorrect. And so how can we work with business communities to address the myths that might be there, but also try to troubleshoot some of the real issues of the upfront costs, potentially short-term upfront costs of implementing living wages. We talked about, back to the issue of accessibility and the lack of staff childcare, for example. And there seems to be a circular barrier there in terms of there are training programs available, there are scholarships and subsidy programs available, and many of them are based on a reimbursement model. So people still have to find the money to pay for those upfront and then be reimbursed down the road. And there's an unintended systemic barrier that we could take a look at in policies. We also talked about it's not just policy barriers, there are also societal barriers. And the example that we talked about was the nonprofit sector and the societal expectation that they operate from a scarcity model. Nonprofits are supposed to operate from with a very low administration cost. And so just the challenges to the sector in terms of paying a living wage. And we talked about where this morning I heard a lot from local municipalities who were either thinking of or who had put into place procurement policies asking their suppliers to pay a living wage. And we also threw the challenge back to governments and funders to adjust their funding policies to encourage the groups that they fund to pay a living wage and adjust the granting amounts they offer to allow for those living wages to be paid. And then the final opportunity, there were two main areas of opportunities that our group identified. One is the opportunity to just scale out really successful programs that are working in one area and could work in others. And we talked about food security programs that connect low-income wage earners to local food. We talked about childcare programs that operate with on school grounds and scaling those out. There's lots of examples of programs that work that could be scaled across the coast. We talked about the opportunity intergovernmentally for the governments on the coast to support each other in being certified as living wage employers, and also supporting each other to come up with consistent practices around procurement, for example. So there's a consistent playing field across the coast. And then the final opportunity that we talked about was to reach out to the downtown business associations, the chambers, and other business associations operating on the coast to make presentations to those groups and to also sit down and talk about the perceived and real challenges that they face in implementing a living wage. Group 3, anything I've missed or misrepresented?
Wonderful, hugely thoughtful conversation. Thank you. Connie, I don't know the number of your group, but you're up next.
You were counting correctly, and thank you, Nicholas, for getting me to take notes. Nicholas threw me under the bus. I just want that known. So we had some general discussions as well, though for the most part followed the questions. Benefits, we went back to the poverty reduction strategy and looking at that lens of homelessness and working poor and how work should bring you out of poverty, not keep you in it, and the difference that this living wage would make. We talked a lot about awareness and education, how it's in our own neighborhoods, and that we may not always see it or be aware of that. Some of the challenges were, to obviously owners of things like coffee shops and grocery stores or places that had traditionally lower wages, and that these stats of cost of living are wildly conservative, to quote one of our group members, which I concur with, and this is nowhere near a thriving wage yet, but it's more easily attainable for employers. So that was a positive. We talked about policy and the policy that exists, with Nicholas quoting that also to note that 50% of kids who are removed from families come from homes that are considered a poverty home. That government policy is now moving the movements of paid MSP, free transit for kids under 12, social assistance, paid sick days, and I may have missed one that I'll get Nicholas to chime in if I have. The living wage is certainly interested in, and businesses are interested in recruitment and retention of employees. We discussed that in a number of groups. I've heard that as well. And that COVID gave us some time to be more reflective on things, and that hopefully we're moving towards a more caring society. One of our group members also mentioned about the what was it, a survey done by the chamber that it's a generational agreement to, or that people are more inclined to be happier to pay higher taxes. That's more the Gen X, or not Gen X, Gen Z and millennials, because of understanding what happens with communities when those investments are made into communities. We looked at policies. What we need to do coming up is we're talking about labor code changes and no contract flipping that has been happening in healthcare and adult basic education. Of course, there's still lots to do in housing and childcare investments. Also looking at folks and how they do procurement, which has been discussed in the larger group, that the living wage is helpful in that to increase the wages of folks who are given these contracts. And we're looking at more things happening with the reviewing our own policies, again, coming back to the next round of the poverty reduction strategy to embed that lens in planning events or other things. And we didn't quite get to the what's next part.
I think there's lots coming up. What's next as we put some of this together. Thank you for that. Group 5, I don't have a reporter yet. Was there a group 5 or did that group get dissolved?
There was a group 5, and I believe Edward's going to report. We were sort of a mixed-mashed group somehow.
Were you mixed from both 5 and 6? That's where I started to lose
No,
track.
we ended up with 4. Anyways, Edward will report on us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where are you, Edward? Okay.
Sorry, it's a bit of a mixed match with my notes. Yeah, I represent the Sunshine Coast Labor Council. And in saying that, most of our members actually do make a living wage. Although the healthcare sector that works for the private contractors as of now still do not make a living wage, but the provincial government is bringing that back in house, so those people will be brought up to the living wage, a minimum living wage. Now getting to so the benefits for a minimum living wage is kind of obvious, but the challenges are for the smaller businesses, like how do they increase their revenue so that they're able to afford that? I mean, that is a big challenge on the Sunshine Coast, where we have so many small businesses that are just basically operating on break even, and we don't have the answers to that. You know, it is what it is today, and that brings us to the housing supply, where the cost of finding accommodation is one of the biggest factors in why we need more money, when we need to earn more money. And again, like, the coast doesn't have the answers. We need a bigger housing supply, but we have to somehow find the incentive for people to build that supply for us and have it be affordable. I mean, John Henderson was in our group, and he suggested that this is something we can do locally, but I kind of think that somewhere down the line we have to get the senior governments involved in this in a big way to kind of turn the tide and get housing more affordable for the average working person. Another thing that came up is that we have a labor shortage here right now, and with our demographics, and going forward, we're going to need more younger people involved in healthcare and other industries. And again, it's limited by the cost of housing. So I think a lot of it comes back to the housing crisis we face here.
Thank you, Edward. That's certainly, there's going to be more conversation about housing, that's for sure. Before I attempt to do a summary, I'm looking for group 6. Did we have a group 6?
Yes, we did, and Lisa's reporting.
Okay, where are you, Lisa?
Sorry, I know you guys are probably handing it to me and my headphones just died, so I'm trying to see how I can switch over. Sorry. Actually, I don't need to be, I can't hear you, but can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs
We can
up.
hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
I can't hear you, but I can give you the breakdown from our group. So we went through the questions, and just for the first one, the benefits and challenges, we said that there's major challenges for lone parent families and that should really be our baseline. And it isn't really a living wage yet for lone parent families, which becomes an accessibility issue. So we'd love to see that updated and taken into account. Yeah, so that it can, so if it supports lone parent families, it is more beneficial for everyone. We also talked about it being a subsistence wage, and not an opportunity for folks to build wealth. And with this being the case, you create a cycle. And as you move into your non-income earning years, that cycle could be ongoing. We talked about there's not much consideration maybe for shocks that might happen, and COVID as an example. And with in that we saw the only place maybe for a buffer is the chance if it's a two-parent family and they're both working, they might have medical coverage from one of their employers, which may free up medical costs and give them like a little bit more of a buffer within that. So the next question, so what would it mean for your business organization? We said the living wage is absolutely critical for people to even survive at this point. And a lot of small businesses have been able to survive as a result of the COVID supports from the government. And there are many small businesses that are barely able to keep their doors open and may not be able to if they were paying a living wage. So with that, we kind of went into, if that's the case and the business can't pay a living wage and say that was the minimum cost of doing business, would that business even be sustainable? And whose responsibility is that? So that was something we took a look at or talked about. And then we also talked about that there was a time when wages were a way to entice people into a job, but the pandemic has shown us that wages are not the only factor for folks looking for work. And so we want to add that. And then one piece of data that we said is unaccounted for is if you're a young person and you have a family that could watch your kids, and then in turn put that money away as savings, then we didn't think that was accounted for. And then moving on to the third question, so public policies that could be implemented. We did acknowledge like small business is so critical to the culture of our communities. And again, going back to what I had previously mentioned, like many small employers may not have the funds to pay for this. So that's where programs from the government may be what we need. And we went as examples, we said like free transportation or free education. And we said that, yeah, there's some growing pains with all of our systems right now. And there's even data to support like folks who have degrees or maybe multiple, say, master's degrees are even having trouble like finding a job or getting paid above the poverty line. So, and we said back again to that business, if small businesses aren't able to pay a living wage, we were saying like, is that acceptable? Because if some businesses are saying, well, we can't stay in business if we pay a living wage, then that business model might not be sustainable. And so we talked about that a lot. And then also we said from a federal government perspective, they're working on a housing strategy along with the childcare program. And another big issue is like a national food program dealing with food security. And that's another big area that we'd like to see something within that area. And finally, for what should happen next, we said, again, on a municipal level, can we address the food systems? And we are saying that many farmers in the community have been moving away from farming because they're finding it hard to actually see it as economically viable. But if we're supposed to be saving on transportation costs within our food if we do keep it local. So we're talking about that. And then we'd like to see next also some more research, post-specific research on separating out demographics, for example, lone parent families and seniors, and then applying those demographics to our region. And then doing case studies that talks more to those, so lone parent families or lone seniors, and helping us, so those case studies could help us to further understand which direction our policy should go in. We'd like to see more research as it relates to the average wages from the hospitality industry on the coast. And then balancing costs versus who pays them. So things like government services of transportation, education, housing might be more economical if paid by the government rather than through wages. And that's what we have. And I'm going to try to get my ears to work because I cannot hear much.
I'm going to give that group the most thorough reward because you really covered each question. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to attempt the daunting task of trying to do a complete summary. Please, forgive me if I've missed something, but there's a few things that jump out at me from these discussions. And I want to thank everybody for how thoughtful you took this task. One of the things that jumped out is the fact that we're at a unique time. And it seems that because of COVID, the dramatic impact that some policies have had and the fact that people have had time to either reflect on issues or they have faced the barriers in a very different way because of the impact of COVID. We're at this unique time. And what the groups have said is that there's places where we can either create some, I think the word was successful models. Like the last group, for example, saying perhaps around the hospitality industry or perhaps around lone parent families or around seniors. And that those successful models may help us learn how to implement a living wage in a way that would have a big impact on our community. Certainly talking about a template for the certification to make certification easy to modify as the years change the needs and the requirements. And what I heard in every group was how these issues are connected. Connected in a number of ways. Connected by what's the policy level. Progress at the provincial policy level will impact capacity for progress at a municipal level. But issue connection, transportation is connected to housing, is connected to food security, and that a living wage is one of the vital pieces that pull this together. And I'll share a neighbor the other day was talking to me about systems thinking and how he uses the spider web. He's a horticulturalist actually, and he was talking about spider webs and how frail an individual strand of a spider web seems to be. But when the whole strands together, a bee can hit that spider web at however many miles an hour and the spider web will expand, but it captures the bee. And it seems to me that that's a relevant image for what we're trying to do. There's so many pieces, but as we build the interconnectedness of what many of you have talked about, connecting the dots, addressing the myths, addressing the education, and trying to recognize where people may be afraid because they lose a way of doing business without knowing, will the new way that they put in place meet the needs? So there's a place for courage. And I think some of the nice things that people said is if we can scale up these successful models, we can also address kind of chronic deficits. For example, how our procurement has a particular expectation for nonprofits that might be different than for municipalities, or how municipalities might share a change to their procurement system that would impact the whole coast. So if there's anything I learned from today, it's that everybody on this call understands that interconnectedness. We might be individual spiders, but I'm pretty sure we each know how to spin a part of the web. And if we pull that together at the policy level where it matters so much, at the education level where it matters so much, and at the support and interconnectedness where we can actually look at what will give us the biggest benefit, then I'm seeing a tremendous willingness to make some shifts. And that might be part of the time we're in, or it might be part of the wonderful people who are on the call. But I'll see if anybody has a strong objection to how I've framed that, and I can try again in our last couple of minutes. But I do think that the thoughtfulness that you've brought to the conversation and how the different perspectives have been presented certainly will be reflected in the report from this day. And I would again encourage people to add things to the chat if you want. We will get the comments from the chat and be able to put that in the report, as well as the answers to the questions that people might not have been able to take notes at. I think I could again continue to try and wax poetic, but I think I'm going to stop and give a moment in case there's people very anxious, because then if no one jumps on the screen immediately, I'll pass it back to Wendy. We are almost exactly at our time frame, which is always the miracle of these events. I never know how it happens that we all come together, we collaborate, we discuss, we're free to talk, and then we end on time. So that's the part that I like, the miracle part. Wendy, I'll turn it over to you for final thoughts on behalf of the foundation.
Thanks very much, Betty. And I just want to close with a few words. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating and for helping us stay on time and for contributing all your thoughts and expertise. And I do want to make an important announcement that as a result of going through this process, the Sunshine Coast Foundation is proud to announce that we have been certified as the first living wage employer on the Lower Sunshine Coast. And yay! And so that's fresh as of, you know, last night, basically. And we did this in pursuit of our mission as a community leader who wants to set an example for other local employers. And we appreciate the leadership of the First Credit Union in Powell River and the City of Victoria, which helped our board understand the implications of becoming a living wage employer. And like them, the 3 employees of the Sunshine Coast Foundation do already earn more than a living wage. And we invite other employers in similar situations, as well as those who might need to raise wages a little bit, to consider joining us in being certified. In terms of follow-up from today's session, we do have a recording, and we will send out the link of the recording to everyone who was invited, as well as the summary notes that we will prepare, so that you can have them to refer to within your own organization when you have these conversations. We also have some hard copies of the Living Wage Report. I meant to have a copy handy here. So we do have some hard copies. And if you would like, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 hard copies, please put your name and address in the chat box and how many copies you'd like. And we will mail those out to you in the next week or so. And obviously the Sunshine Coast Foundation will continue to engage with others in our community and work with you to help improve the quality of life for low wage earners. Finally, I want to thank all of our speakers and our breakout group moderators who were all, the moderators were all Sunshine Coast Foundation board members. I want to especially thank Maggie, Quan, who researched and wrote the Living Wage Report. And I want to thank Anastasia French of the Living Wage for Families campaign, because she was extremely helpful throughout the process of developing the report. I want to thank the Sunshine Coast Foundation Vital Signs Committee, which was the group that oversaw the report and the planning of this event. Thank you to Betty for doing such a great job of facilitating, and thanks to Naomi Fleshat, who helped with the Zoom logistics and the note taking. And then finally, I want to again thank our sponsor, Leith Wheeler, who gave us a grant to help cover the costs associated with today's event. So thanks everybody, and that wraps it up for me. Thanks, Betty. Okay, so we'll say goodbye to all and end the Zoom meeting, but thanks so much everyone for joining us today.